My name is Dora, and I'm 53 years old. 25 years ago, I became a single mother when my husband died in a car accident, leaving me to raise our 8-year-old daughter, Madison, alone. I worked tirelessly to build my insurance company from nothing, creating a multi-million-dollar trust fund for Madison's future. I thought her wedding day would be the happiest moment of my life, watching my beautiful daughter marry the man she loved. Instead, it became my worst nightmare. I was escorted out of Madison's wedding like I was some kind of embarrassment, treated like a stranger at my own daughter's most important day. But what happened next changed everything they had planned. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, what Madison and her new in-laws did to me will shock you to your core. The way money can reveal people's true colors is something every parent needs to hear. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding our relationship makes what happened even more heartbreaking. When Madison was 8 years old, my world collapsed in a single phone call. My husband David had been driving home from work on a rainy November evening when an 18-wheeler ran a red light and slammed into his sedan. He died instantly, leaving me alone with a little girl who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. Those early years as a single mother were the hardest thing I've ever experienced. I was 28 years old, working as a junior agent at a small insurance firm, barely making enough to cover our modest apartment rent. But I made a promise to David's grave and to Madison that I would give her everything I possibly could. I worked 16-hour days, took night classes to get my certifications, and slowly built my client base one policy at a time. Madison grew up watching me sacrifice everything for our future. She saw me turn down dates because I had to review contracts. She watched me skip meals to pay for her piano lessons, ballet classes, and tennis coaching. By the time she was in high school, my hard work had paid off. I had built Williams Insurance Group into one of the most successful independent agencies in Connecticut, specializing in high-net-worth clients who needed complex coverage solutions. Every milestone in Madison's life, I was there. Front row at every recital, cheering at every tennis match, helping with every school project. We spent our summers traveling through Europe, exploring castles in Scotland and museums in Paris. During spring breaks, we'd retreat to our house in the Hamptons, where Madison learned to sail, and I taught her about managing money and investments. When Madison graduated from Harvard Business School, summa cum laude, I cried harder than she did. She was brilliant, ambitious, and had every opportunity in the world ahead of her. She used to call me her best friend and her hero, saying she wanted to build a business empire just like mine. We talked every day, shared everything, and I truly believed we had the kind of mother-daughter bond that would last forever. But looking back now, I realize I may have protected her too much from life's harsh realities. She had never experienced real loss, real betrayal, or real consequences for her choices. She lived in a bubble of privilege that I had worked so hard to create, never understanding the sacrifices that bubble required. That innocence would soon be shattered when she met the Hampton family, though not in the way I had hoped. Madison met Trevor Hampton at a charity gala for children's cancer research in Manhattan during the fall of her final year at Harvard. She called me that night breathless with excitement, describing this incredibly handsome and charming man who had bid $20,000 on a weekend in the Bahamas just to impress her. Trevor was 29 years old, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the confidence that only comes from being born into extreme wealth. Trevor Hampton was the vice president of Hampton Real Estate Development, a family empire that his grandfather had started in the 1950s. The Hampton family owned over 300 buildings throughout New York City, from luxury apartment complexes on the Upper East Side to commercial properties in Midtown Manhattan. Their net worth was estimated at nearly $500 million, and they moved in circles that included senators, celebrities, and old money families whose names appeared on museum wings and university buildings. When Madison brought Trevor to meet me for the first time, I chose Le Bernardin thinking a sophisticated restaurant would set the right tone. I should have known something was wrong from the moment Richard Hampton Trevor's father walked in wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself like European royalty visiting a colony. Richard immediately began what I can only describe as an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. He asked about my pedigree, wanting to know which families I was connected to and whether our money was old or new. When I explained that I had built my business myself after my husband's death, his smile became condescending, and he made a comment about how admirable it was when people pulled themselves up, though it was quite different from families who had always been established. Patricia Hampton. Trevor's mother was equally problematic, but in a more subtle way. She was perfectly polite on the surface, but every question carried an undertone of judgment. She asked about Madison's upbringing, wondering if she had been exposed to proper society and whether she understood the responsibilities that came with marrying into a family of their standing. When I mentioned that Madison had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, Patricia smiled tightly and said, "Oh, how wonderful, though of course academic achievement is quite different from social refinement." What disturbed me most was Trevor's behavior throughout this dinner. He sat there smiling pleasantly, while his parents essentially insulted me to my face, never once defending me or steering the conversation in a more respectful direction. When his father made a particularly snide comment about new money lacking generational wisdom, Trevor actually chuckled and nodded as if he agreed. Madison, meanwhile, seemed completely enchanted by the Hampton family's wealth and status. She hung on every word Patricia said about their homes in the Hamptons' Aspen and Martha's Vineyard. She was fascinated by their connections to famous politicians and celebrities, and I watched my intelligent, independent daughter transform into someone eager to please and impress people who clearly looked down on us. After that dinner, I noticed changes in Madison that made my heart ache. She started criticizing aspects of our lifestyle that had never bothered her before, calling our house a bit too flashy and suggesting that I was trying too hard with my clothing choices. She began using phrases like old money elegance and talking about how refined people behaved differently from people who just happened to make money. The Madison I had raised to be confident and proud of our accomplishments was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone desperate to fit into a world that was making it clear she didn't naturally belong. But she was so in love with Trevor and so dazzled by the Hampton lifestyle that she couldn't see what I was beginning to understand. To them, she wasn't a future daughter-in-law. She was an acquisition. 6 months later, Trevor proposed to Madison with a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond ring during a romantic weekend at Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley. Madison called me immediately after accepting, and I could hear the joy and excitement in her voice as she described the perfect proposal overlooking the valley at sunset. But even in that moment of happiness, something in her words made me uneasy. She kept saying things like, "Trevor's family has already started planning, and they have such wonderful ideas for the wedding." When Madison and Trevor came to my house the following week to officially announce their engagement, I tried to be genuinely happy for them. Trevor seemed more confident than ever, clearly pleased with himself for securing Madison's hand in marriage. But during our conversation, he mentioned that they wanted to keep the wedding intimate and elegant, with only immediate family and very close friends attending. When I asked about the guest list and venue options, Madison became vague and evasive, saying they would handle all the details and that I shouldn't worry about anything. Trevor added that his family had extensive experience with high society weddings and knew exactly how things should be done to maintain the proper caliber of event. The way he said it made it clear that he didn't think I would understand what constituted proper wedding planning for people of their level. A few weeks later, Madison mentioned casually that she and Trevor had scheduled a meeting with my financial advisor without consulting me first. When I expressed surprise and asked why, she explained that Trevor's family wanted to understand the family financial picture before the wedding so they could help with estate planning and tax optimization strategies after the marriage. I felt deeply uncomfortable with this request, but Madison assured me it was just standard practice among wealthy families to coordinate their financial planning. She said Patricia had explained that when families of substantial means merge, it was important to have comprehensive understanding of all assets to ensure the most efficient management of resources. During this conversation, Trevor mentioned that his family's financial advisors had suggested that Madison and I consider consolidating certain assets to take advantage of family trust structures that could provide significant tax benefits. He spoke about these complex financial arrangements as if they were simple common sense, but something about his eagerness to discuss my money made warning bells go off in my head. Madison started asking me detailed questions about the trust fund I had established for her, wanting to know exact amounts, maturation dates, and transfer procedures. She also inquired about inheritance laws and whether certain assets could be moved or restructured before the wedding. When I asked why these details mattered so urgently, she said Trevor's family financial team needed to coordinate everything properly to avoid unnecessary complications after they were married. I began to realize that the Hampton family wasn't just interested in Madison herself. They had done their research and knew exactly how much money was involved in this marriage. What disturbed me most was that Madison seemed completely unaware that she was being evaluated as much for her financial worth as for her personal qualities. She was so caught up in the romance and the glamour of marrying into such a prominent family that she couldn't see the calculating nature of their interest in her inheritance. The wedding planning process became a masterclass in subtle exclusion and manipulation. Despite being the mother of the bride and the person paying for Madison's entire lifestyle, I found myself systematically shut out of every major decision while being made to feel like I was overstepping boundaries whenever I tried to participate. Patricia Hampton took control of the planning, with military precision informing Madison that she had connections with the most exclusive vendors and venues in the area. When I offered to contribute financially to the wedding expenses, Richard Hampton actually laughed and said they had already handled all the arrangements and didn't need any outside assistance. The way he said outside made it clear that despite my being Madison's mother, I was considered an outsider to their family planning process. The venue selection happened without my input entirely. Patricia and Madison spent a weekend touring estates in the Hamptons, ultimately choosing the Hampton family's private compound for the ceremony and reception. When Madison excitedly showed me photos of the beautiful waterfront property, I asked if I could visit to see the space and discuss logistics. Patricia politely but firmly explained that the property was private family grounds, and they preferred to handle all the coordination internally. The dress shopping experience was perhaps the most hurtful exclusion. Madison and Patricia scheduled appointments at exclusive bridal boutiques in Manhattan, visiting designers whose gowns started at $15,000. When I asked about joining them, Madison hesitated and said that Patricia had established relationships with these designers and knew exactly what style would be appropriate for their family's social circle. I was told that the designer they chose was so exclusive that not everyone can access their collection, and that Patricia's reputation and connections were what made the appointments possible. Madison tried to soften the blow by saying Patricia simply had better taste in high-end fashion than most people, but the message was clear. I wasn't sophisticated enough to participate in choosing my own daughter's wedding dress. When the invitations arrived, I discovered that I wasn't listed as mother of the bride, but simply as Ms. Dora Williams' guest. My heart broke when I saw that listing, and when I brought it to Madison's attention, she claimed it was a printing error and promised to have it corrected. The corrected invitations never materialized, and when I brought it up again, Madison became defensive and said I was making too big a deal about minor details. The seating arrangements were the final insult. Instead of being seated at the family table with Madison Trevor and the Hampton parents, I was assigned to table 12, positioned far from the photographer's range and with no clear view of the altar. When I questioned this arrangement, Madison explained that there were many Hampton extended family members who had to be accommodated at the main family tables, and the seating had been organized logically based on family hierarchies. I started to understand that this wasn't just wedding planning. This was a systematic effort to establish my place in Madison's new life, and that place was clearly meant to be peripheral. The Hampton family was making it obvious that they considered themselves Madison's primary family now, while I was being relegated to the role of distant relative, invited out of obligation rather than love. The morning of Madison's wedding dawned crisp and beautiful with golden September sunshine streaming across the Hampton family's waterfront estate. I had spent hours getting ready, choosing a sophisticated navy blue Oscar de la Renta dress that I thought struck the perfect balance between elegant and understated. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt proud and emotional thinking about how far Madison and I had come since those difficult early days after David's death. I arrived at the Hampton estate with my heart full of anticipation and love for my daughter. However, from the moment I stepped out of my car, I sensed that something was wrong. The security personnel checked my invitation with unusual thoroughness, comparing it against some kind of master list, and making phone calls to verify my identity, while other guests were waved through with barely a glance. When I approached the entrance, I wasn't escorted to my seat like the other family members. Instead, I was handed a small map of the property and told to find table 12 on your own. I watched as Hampton family members and their close friends were personally guided to their seats by ushers offered champagne and treated with obvious deference and respect. Table 12 was positioned at the very back of the seating area, behind a decorative hedge that partially blocked the view of the altar. My table companions were distant acquaintances of Trevor's family people, who seemed as confused as I was about why they had been relegated to such an insignificant location. The photographer had clearly been instructed to focus on the front sections, because throughout the entire ceremony, not a single photo was taken of our area. During the ceremony itself, I found myself overwhelmed with emotion, watching Madison walk down the aisle in her stunning Vera Wang gown. She looked absolutely radiant, and despite everything that had happened during the planning process, I felt tremendous love and pride seeing my daughter on her wedding day. When the pastor reached the traditional moment where he asked, "Does anyone object to this union?" I felt tears streaming down my face. Not from objection, but from remembering David and wishing he could have been there to see his little girl get married. Patricia Hampton noticed my emotional response and immediately whispered something urgent to Richard, pointing in my direction. I could see them having an intense conversation, but I was too far away to hear what they were saying. Richard's expression darkened as he looked over at me, and I had the terrible feeling that my tears of joy and remembrance were being misinterpreted as something sinister. During the cocktail reception, I approached Madison to congratulate her and tell her how beautiful she looked. In that moment of happiness, I mentioned that we would need to schedule a meeting with my financial advisor after their honeymoon to complete the trust fund transfer as we had planned. It was meant to be a loving reminder that her financial security was assured, but Trevor's cousin Jake was standing nearby and overheard our conversation. Within minutes, Jake had reported back to Richard Hampton, and I watched as the information spread through the Hampton family like wildfire. Richard's face turned red with anger, and he began striding across the reception area directly toward me. The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare that I still can't fully believe actually happened. Richard confronted me in front of dozens of guests, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He accused me of trying to manipulate the newlyweds with money and using financial leverage to control Madison's marriage. He claimed that I was inappropriate and out of line for bringing up business matters at a wedding celebration. What broke my heart completely was Madison's reaction. Instead of defending me or asking Richard to lower his voice and speak privately, she actually supported his accusations. In front of all those people, my own daughter said that I always make everything about money and that I was ruining her special day with my controlling behavior. Trevor stood silently beside his new wife, not saying a single word in my defense. Patricia Hampton called over 2 security guards and asked them to escort this disruptive guest off the property immediately. I was walked out of my daughter's wedding reception like I was some kind of criminal or unstable person who posed a threat to the celebration. As I was led away from the reception area, I could hear the conversations and whispers of the other guests, all speculating about what I had done to deserve such treatment. The humiliation was complete and devastating. I had been publicly ejected from the most important day of my daughter's life, branded as a troublemaker and a manipulative person in front of everyone she wanted to impress. I drove home from the Hampton estate in a state of shock and heartbreak that I had never experienced before, not even when David died. At least his death had been an accident, a tragedy that no one had chosen to inflict on our family. But what had just happened was a deliberate and calculated humiliation, orchestrated by people who had decided I was expendable now that they had access to Madison and her inheritance. I spent that entire night awake, replaying every moment of the wedding disaster and trying to understand how my relationship with Madison had deteriorated to this point. By dawn, my heartbreak had transformed into something much more focused and determined. If the Hampton family wanted to treat me like an enemy, they were about to learn exactly what kind of enemy I could be when properly motivated. The next morning, I called my financial advisor, my attorney, and my accountant to arrange an emergency meeting. I explained the situation calmly and professionally and asked them to implement an immediate freeze on Madison's trust fund and all associated accounts. The trust fund contained $2.3 million that had been accumulated over 25 years of careful investing and saving. Additionally, Madison had been receiving a monthly allowance of $15,000 that covered her rent car payments, shopping, and lifestyle expenses. My financial team explained that since the trust fund was discretionary, and I maintained full control until Madison's 30th birthday, I had complete legal authority to freeze or modify access at any time. They also informed me about some concerning financial documents that Madison had signed recently, giving Trevor's family financial advisors access to information about her expected inheritance and future trust fund distributions. Most shocking was the discovery that Madison had apparently promised the Hampton family that her trust fund money would be available for investment in their new Miami development project, a luxury resort and residential complex that required significant upfront capital from investors. The Hampton family had been counting on Madison's money to fund their expansion plans, treating her inheritance as if it were already their own asset to deploy. I instructed my team to revoke all of Madison's credit cards that were connected to my accounts, cancel her monthly allowances, and freeze any automatic payments that I had been covering. This included her rent for the luxury apartment she shared with Trevor, her car insurance, and payments her health insurance, her gym membership, her shopping accounts at various high-end stores, and even her subscription services. The immediate impact was swift and dramatic. Madison and Trevor were in Santorini for their honeymoon, staying at the most expensive resort on the island in a presidential suite that cost $8,000 per night. When they tried to check out after their week-long stay, Madison's credit cards were declined and they couldn't cover their hotel bill. Trevor had to make an embarrassing phone call to his father, asking for an emergency wire transfer to cover their honeymoon expenses. I later learned that Richard was furious about having to send money to cover costs that he had assumed would be handled by Madison's family resources, meaning my money. When Madison and Trevor returned from their honeymoon, they discovered that their apartment rent, which was $5,000 per month for their luxury two-bedroom in Manhattan, had not been paid. The building management had posted notices about late fees and potential eviction procedures. Madison had quit her job at a consulting firm after the engagement, confident that her trust fund income would make working unnecessary. Trevor's salary as a vice president in his family's company was substantial by normal standards, but nowhere near enough to maintain the lifestyle that he and Madison had planned based on her expected inheritance. The Hampton family had structured Trevor's compensation conservatively, assuming that his wife's money would supplement their household income significantly. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, Richard Hampton called me personally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. He demanded an explanation for why Madison's family obligations were not being honored and actually threatened legal action if I didn't restore normal financial arrangements immediately. He accused me of punishing innocent young people and called my actions vindictive and destructive. I listened to his entire rant without interrupting, then calmly explained that the money in question had always been mine, that I had complete discretionary control over its distribution, and that recent events had caused me to reconsider my previous plans for Madison's financial independence. When Richard continued to argue and make threats, I simply hung up the phone. The Hampton family had made a critical miscalculation. They had treated me as if I were powerless and irrelevant, assuming that once Madison was married into their family, they would automatically gain access to her inheritance. They had humiliated me publicly and encouraged Madison to disrespect and dismiss me, never considering that I might have both the resources and the resolve to fight back effectively. 6 months after Madison's wedding, I received a phone call that I had been both expecting and dreading. Madison's voice was quiet and strained, completely different from the confident, happy tone she had maintained throughout her engagement and the early weeks of her marriage. She asked if we could meet for coffee, saying she had things she needed to discuss with me privately. When I saw Madison at the small cafe she had chosen, I barely recognized my daughter. She looked tired and stressed, wearing clothes that I realized were several months old, rather than the constantly refreshed wardrobe she had maintained when her allowances were flowing freely. Most striking was the absence of the confident, almost arrogant demeanor she had developed during her time with the Hampton family. Madison began our conversation with a genuine apology that brought tears to both of our eyes. She admitted that she had been completely wrong about the wedding situation and that she was ashamed of how she had treated me that day. She explained that the Hampton family had spent months convincing her that I was too controlling and that her marriage would be healthier without my constant interference in their decisions. She told me that Patricia and Richard had painted me as someone who used money to manipulate and control people, suggesting that the only way for Madison to have a truly independent marriage was to establish clear boundaries with me from the beginning. They had convinced her that my emotional reaction at the wedding was an attempt to disrupt the ceremony, and that having me escorted out was necessary to protect the celebration. But the months following the wedding had revealed the truth about the Hampton family's motivations and character. When Madison's money disappeared, so did much of their warmth and support. Patricia stopped inviting her to social events and family gatherings, explaining that Madison needed to establish her own social connections rather than relying on family introductions. Trevor's behavior toward Madison changed dramatically once the financial pressure mounted. He became critical and resentful, blaming her for losing the family fortune, and making it clear that he had expected her inheritance to fund their lifestyle and his family's business ventures. Arguments about money became constant, and Trevor began working late most evenings, leaving Madison alone in their expensive apartment that they could barely afford. Most painful for Madison was the realization that the Hampton family had never been interested in her as a person, but had seen her primarily as a financial asset to be acquired. Richard had actually told Trevor that Madison's value to the family had been significantly diminished by the loss of her inheritance and that they might need to reconsider their investment in the marriage if the financial situation couldn't be resolved. Madison had also learned about the Miami development project and how her trust fund money had been allocated for investment before she even knew about the project's existence. The Hampton family had made financial commitments based on anticipated access to her inheritance, and when that money became unavailable, they were forced to seek alternative funding sources that were much less favorable to their profit margins. During our conversation, Madison asked me about my life during the months we hadn't spoken. I told her about the traveling I had done visiting children's hospitals and cancer research centers where I had been volunteering and making charitable contributions. I explained how this time away had helped me understand that I had perhaps been too focused on providing everything for her financially without teaching her important lessons about earning, appreciating, and managing money responsibly. I had also spent considerable time in therapy, working through my feelings about single motherhood control, and the way my love for Madison had sometimes manifested as overprotection rather than preparation for independent adult life. I realized that by shielding her from financial stress and responsibility, I had failed to teach her how to recognize when people were interested in her money rather than her character. Madison asked directly whether I would consider restoring her trust fund access, and I explained the new conditions I had established. She would need to work full-time for at least 2 years, demonstrating her ability to earn and manage her own income. She would also need to complete comprehensive financial literacy courses, learning about investing estate planning and protecting assets from potential exploitation. Most importantly, I had restructured the trust fund to require that any future spouse sign a comprehensive prenuptial agreement that would protect the assets for Madison's exclusive use and prevent them from being accessed or leveraged by in-laws for their own business ventures. These new terms would ensure that anyone who married Madison would be interested in her as a person, rather than as a source of funding. Madison accepted these conditions without argument, expressing relief that there was a path forward for rebuilding our relationship and her financial security. She had already started looking for employment and was prepared to rebuild her life on more solid, independent foundations. Looking back on this entire experience, I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices. Being a good mother doesn't mean saying yes to everything, and sometimes love requires saying no to protect the people we care about from their own poor judgment. Money reveals people's true character more clearly than almost anything else, but it should never define your worth or determine the quality of your relationships. True family stands by you when you have nothing left to give except your love, and anyone who treats you differently based on your financial status doesn't deserve access to either your money or your heart. I also realized that creating wealth carries the responsibility of teaching the next generation how to handle it wisely, protect it effectively, and use it to build meaningful lives, rather than simply maintaining appearances or impressing people who don't truly matter. The trust fund is still there waiting for Madison when she's ready to receive it responsibly. But more importantly, our relationship is being rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect, honest communication, and shared values, rather than financial dependence and unspoken expectations. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters, and sometimes the people who try to separate you from your family end up teaching you exactly how valuable that family really is. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect someone you love from their own choices? How did you handle a situation where money revealed someone's true intentions? Let me know in the comments below what you think about Madison's transformation, and whether you believe the Hampton family got what they deserved. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family money and the complicated relationships between parents and adult children. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with similar family dynamics or financial manipulation. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions, even when it's painful for everyone involved. I hope your families are built on love, respect, and genuine care for each other, rather than financial calculations and social climbing.